Eugene Munzel was a businessman who, in 1908, took his own life. Laying in bed, he asked his wife if she would be able to get him a glass of milk. When she left the bedroom, he walked to the window of a 7th-floor apartment building in New York City, and he jumped. This is his story. Eugene was the son of Ransom and Louisa. His father, Ransom, in 1843, moved to New York City from Albany, and he was a stove manufacturer. So we know where Eugene got his stove smarts from. His father passed away in 1859 at the young age of 38 years old. Eugene was born on April 18th, 1851, and he was the only surviving son of his parents that made it past the teenage years. All of his other siblings died. They passed away at the ages of 1, 2, 13, and 17 years old. While trying to find more information about Eugene's life, it was somewhat hard, and unfortunately, I was not even able to find a picture of him. He did travel quite often, and the newspaper article that tells the sad tale of his death mentions some interesting facts at the end. He married his wife Harriet in 1896, who had been previously married and had a daughter from that marriage. She passed away several years later after the death of her husband. She passed away in 1939. Eugene was well known in the stove business, and then after taking on the stove business, he moved over to the mica insulator business, which was very profitable during that time. Unfortunately, his involvement in this industry, being the president of his company, took a toll on him. His partner of the firm passed away a year prior to Eugene taking his own life, and that no doubt had some added stress to running the company. He also experienced many bouts of insomnia, which also added to his stress. Taken from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, New York, Saturday, April 25th, 1908. Suicide of E. Munzel jumped 7 stories. President of Mica Insulating Company worried over his financial condition, also victim of insomnia. Sent wife out of his room in the Van Dyke Apartments in Manhattan and leaped to Broadway pavement. Worried over financial matters and driven to desperation by insomnia, Eugene Munzel, 56 years old, president of the Mica Insulating Company, committed suicide this morning by jumping from the window of his apartment of the 7th floor of the Van Dyke Apartments, Broadway and 72nd Street, Manhattan. Mr. Munzel was instantly killed. He had persuaded his wife, who had been sitting up with him all night, to get him a glass of milk, and in her absence, raised the window and jumped out. Mr. Munzel, for a number of years, was in the stove business at 218 Water Street, Manhattan, in which he succeeded his father. Later, he became interested in the mica insulating business and was one of the first to go into that trade. His office is at 68 Church Street. Associated with him in this enterprise was Louis Kingsley. Franklin Brooks, who died last year, was another member of the firm. Mr. Munzel's wife was the widow of Alonzo Wheeler. Ever since the financial panic of last fall, Mr. Munzel had been constantly worried. Although his wife suspected that he was in financial trouble, he said nothing about it until during Easter week. The family had usually gone to Aiken, South Carolina for that week, but this year Mr. Munzel told his wife that he could not leave the city. Then the others of the family decided that they would not go and leave him alone. For a week, Mr. Munzel had been ill, and yesterday he was feeling better, and his friend Ryan Platt of the Hotel Regent took him out for a ride in an automobile. When he returned to the house, he seemed to be in a better mood. Later in the evening, however, Mr. Munzel went to a newsstand across from the hotel and bought a paper. He read something in it and then paced up and down in front of the apartment house, apparently greatly excited. Manager Thomas of the house spoke to him and got a very curt answer. This surprised the manager, as Mr. Munzel had generally been very courteous. At 9 o'clock, Mr. Munzel retired. The family left word that they would receive no telephone messages. For weeks, Mr. Munzel had been unable to sleep well. He last retired to his room, which, on the corner, facing both Broadway and 72nd Street. His wife heard him tossing about and went in. She found him restless and unable to sleep and stayed by his side. Several times he told her she ought to go to bed and get some sleep, but she drew an easy chair up beside the bed and announced her intention of staying there. Several times Mr. Munsell fell into a doze, which, however, lasted for but a few minutes. He was still wide awake later and asked for a drink of milk. Mrs. Munsell started to call a maid, but he asked her not to do that. "It will taste better if you get the milk for me," he said. To humor him, Mrs. Munsell left the room and went to the pantry in the rear of the apartment and could not find her husband in the bedroom when she returned. She called him, but there was no answer. She was joined by her sister, who was visiting. Mrs. Marguerite Wheeler, daughter of Mrs. Munsell, was aroused, as well as the two maids employed by the family. The women looked through every room in the apartment, but found no trace of the man. Then they noticed a draft from the window and saw that it had been raised from the bottom above 3 inches. The curtain had been lowered. Looking out the window, they saw several men bending over the white-clad form of Mr. Munsell, several stories below. From the police investigation, it is believed as soon as his wife left to get the milk, Mr. Munsell climbed out on the wide window ledge and then closed the window down behind him and drew the curtain down by the handling cord. This, they think, was done so that his wife would not see him if he had not gathered up the courage to take the jump before she returned to the room. James Bowie of 1042 Jefferson Street, Brooklyn, a signalman in the subway, had just stepped out of the 72nd Street station of the subway and saw the body fall. He called Patrolman White of the West 68th Street station. When Mr. Derby of Roosevelt Hospital arrived, he said that Mr. Munsell had evidently been instantly killed. He had fallen on his back on the sidewalk on the Broadway side. The coroner is investigating the case. The body is removed to the West 68th Street station house. Mr. Munsell had a magnificent art collection at his home. Every year he made several trips abroad, partly for business, also for pleasure. He generally gathered up a lot of statues and pictures. His collection was large and valuable. He made 5 trips abroad last year, returning each time with some artwork. So it appears that Eugene was a collector, that he loved going abroad and finding treasures, many which us can relate to. And I assume that many of us can also relate to the stresses of work, the lack of sleep because of those stresses. So back in 1908, the stresses then aren't as different as the stresses now in 2019. The following is a small presentation of Eugene, some snippets from newspapers, some information about both his stove company and his mica company. Following that is the National Helpline for Suicide Prevention. I encourage any and all of you that are experiencing signs of depression or thoughts of suicide, or if you have friends, family members, or coworkers that might be going through tough times, to lend a hand, whether it's a cup of coffee, a conversation, or even to pass along the helpline number.